My name is Miriam Bennett, and I'm 30 years old. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening at what I thought was just another family dinner. My father slammed an invoice onto the table in front of me, the paper hitting the wood so hard my wine glass trembled. $85,000. That's what the number at the bottom said. My mother leaned forward, her voice sharp as broken glass when she delivered the ultimatum that would fracture our family forever. Pay for your sister's wedding, it's your duty as the eldest, or disappear from this family forever. My hands shook as I held that ridiculous bill, itemized down to the last champagne flute. Across the table, my younger sister Bianca smirked at me, her enormous engagement ring catching the chandelier light like a warning flare. Before I tell you what I said, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Have you ever dealt with family members who expected you to bankroll their dreams? Hit that like button if you've ever been pressured by relatives who confused love with a blank check, and subscribe because this story is about to take turns you won't believe. Trust me, what happened next involves fraud, public humiliation, arrests, and a viral social media war that exposed secrets no one saw coming. To understand how we got to that dining room showdown, you need to know that Bianca and I grew up in two completely different families, even though we shared the same house. From the moment she was born, 6 years after me, Bianca became the sun around which our parents' world orbited, and I became the moon, visible only when she wasn't shining. When Bianca wanted dance lessons, piano lessons, art classes, and summer camps at exclusive programs, my parents wrote checks without hesitation. When I asked for help with college application fees, my father told me that hard work built character and handed me newspaper classified ads for part-time jobs. Bianca attended Stanford University, her tuition paid in full by our parents, while I worked 3 jobs simultaneously to afford state school, eating ramen for dinner most nights, and sleeping 4 hours between shifts at the campus library, a coffee shop, and weekend retail work. The inequity wasn't subtle. For her 16th birthday, Bianca received a brand new sedan with a bow on top, the whole neighborhood watching as she squealed and jumped up and down. I bought my own used Honda at 23 with money ID saved for 2 years, and when I proudly showed it to my parents, my father barely looked up from his newspaper to grunt acknowledgement. Every family gathering, every holiday, every Sunday dinner revolved entirely around Bianca's minimal achievements, which our parents treated like Nobel Prize wins, while my actual accomplishments vanished into silence. When I graduated with my MBA at the top of my class, my parents attended the ceremony but left immediately after to help Bianca move into a new apartment. When I got promoted to director at a major tech firm at 28, making more money than anyone else in our extended family, my mother's only response was to ask if the increased responsibility meant I'd be too busy to help with Bianca's upcoming events. My father had one phrase he repeated like a mantra whenever I felt brave enough to point out the disparity. "You're the responsible one, Miriam. You don't need our help." My mother's version was softer but equally cutting. "Your sister is more sensitive than you. She needs more support." What they really meant was that I had been designated the family workhorse, expected to pull the cart while Bianca rode in it, waving like royalty. The engagement announcement came 2 months before that fateful dinner, delivered with the theatrical flair Bianca brought to everything. She and her fiancé Preston, a finance guy whose arrogance filled rooms before he entered them, hosted a reveal party that my parents funded to the tune of $15,000. They invited 150 people to a rented event space, complete with a live band, open bar, and a choreographed moment where Preston got down on one knee again for the cameras, even though had already proposed weeks earlier during a vacation to Napa Valley. I stood in the corner of that party, barely acknowledged, treated like hired help when my mother kept sending me to check on catering or parking arrangements. Preston's family was supposed to be incredibly wealthy, old money from the Northeast, and Bianca had spent the entire evening making sure everyone knew she was marrying up into a world of country clubs and investment portfolios. Her Pinterest board for the wedding had been started years before she even met Preston, a digital shrine to excess featuring luxury resort venues, designer gowns that cost more than cars, and celebrity florists whose arrangements appeared in magazines. When my parents first mentioned that they wanted to discuss wedding finances, I assumed they were telling me about their budget or asking for input on reasonable planning. I was naive. The demand didn't start as a request. It started as an assumption, a foregone conclusion they'd apparently decided weeks earlier without consulting me. My father opened the conversation by telling me I owed the family for all they'd sacrificed over the years, a statement so absurd I actually laughed before I realized he was serious. He laid out his twisted logic with the confidence of a prosecutor presenting an airtight case. "We gave you life, Miriam. We raised you, fed you, put a roof over your head, now you give back. That's how families work." My mother jumped in with her specialty, the guilt trip wrapped in martyrdom. After everything we did, all those years of parenting, this is what family does for each other. But it was Bianca who revealed the entitlement at the core of their demand, her voice dripping with disdain for my hesitation. "You make good money now," she said, examining her manicured nails. "It's honestly selfish if you refuse to help me have the wedding I deserve." That's when they dropped the real bomb. They'd already booked everything. The venue, a 5-star resort in wine country, had been reserved with a non-refundable deposit. The wedding planner, someone who'd coordinated events for tech billionaires and celebrities, was already drawing up timelines. Vendors had been hired, promises made, contracts signed, all before they'd bothered to confirm I would pay. The invoice my father thrust at me that night itemized their assumptions like I was reviewing a restaurant bill it already agreed to cover. $30,000 for the venue rental. $15,000 for Bianca's designer dress from a boutique where appointments required references. $20,000 for catering that included a ridiculous menu featuring ingredients I couldn't pronounce. $10,000 for flowers, another $10,000 for photography, $5,000 for videography, $8,000 for the band, $3,000 for invitations, $2,000 for party favors, and the list continued down the page in neat, accusatory columns. They hadn't asked for my help. They'd spent my money without permission and expected me to quietly write the check to validate their decision. The week after that dinner, my parents launched what I can only describe as a coordinated emotional warfare campaign designed to break down my resistance through sheer attrition. My mother called me every single day, sometimes multiple times, her voice always trembling with manufactured tears as she spoke about family unity, sacrifice, and the importance of sisters supporting each other. These weren't conversations, they were performances, scripts she'd rehearsed about how disappointed my grandparents would be if they were alive to see me tearing the family apart over money. My father took a different approach, sending accusatory text messages at all hours that painted me as someone transformed by success into a cruel stranger. "You've changed, Miriam. Money made you forget where you came from. You used to care about family." Bianca deployed social media as her weapon, posting vague messages about dealing with unsupportive people, facing unexpected obstacles, and learning who really loved her, all carefully worded to make her followers curious while pointing an invisible finger directly at me. The comments under her posts filled with supportive messages from friends who had no idea what was really happening, telling her to stay strong and cut toxic people out of her life. But the real manipulation was happening behind the scenes, and I didn't discover it until relatives started calling to congratulate me on my generosity. My aunt from Oregon phoned to tell me how proud she was that I was paying for the wedding, what a wonderful sister I was being. My uncle in Texas sent a text thanking me for stepping up when the family needed it. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly messaging about what an amazing gesture I was making. Each conversation left me more confused until the horrifying truth became clear. My parents had been telling everyone that I had volunteered to pay, that I'd insisted on covering all the costs as my gift to Bianca. They'd constructed an elaborate lie and spread it through our entire extended family, trapping me in a social prison of their design. If I denied it now, I would look like a liar. If I refused to pay after they'd told everyone I'd already committed, I'd be the villain who went back on her word, the wealthy daughter who abandoned her family when they needed her. Bianca's social media strategy became more aggressive as the week progressed. She posted a photo of herself crying happy tears with a caption that made my blood boil. "So blessed to have an amazing sister who's making all my wedding dreams come true. Sometimes family shows up in the most beautiful ways." The post exploded with likes and shares, comments flooding in from people praising me by name, strangers telling Bianca how lucky she was to have such a generous sibling. I watched the numbers climb, my reputation being crafted by lies, unable to publicly correct the record without looking petty or vindictive. Every hour, I stayed silent. The narrative solidified, the fiction becoming fact through repetition and social proof. My parents had turned my refusal into acceptance through sheer manipulation of public perception, and they'd done it so smoothly that most people would never believe I hadn't volunteered. Something about their aggressive desperation bothered me, a nagging instinct that suggested more was happening beneath the surface. I started investigating quietly, looking into my parents' financial situation with the same analytical skills I used at work. What I found shocked me. They weren't broke, not even close. My father had recently purchased a new luxury truck, the kind with every upgrade and feature, for $65,000. My mother had remodeled their kitchen the previous year, a project that cost $40,000 and resulted in magazine-worthy counters and appliances. They took cruises, belonged to an expensive golf club, and maintained a lifestyle that required significant disposable income. They had money. They simply chose not to spend it on Bianca's wedding, preferring instead to manipulate me into funding it while they preserved their own assets. The realization hit me like cold water. This wasn't about inability to pay. This was a test of my obedience, a power play to see if they could make me comply with unreasonable demands just because they were my parents. My best friend Nora, who'd known me since college and witnessed years of my family's dysfunction, was horrified when I told her everything. We sat in her living room while I showed her the texts, the social media posts, and the evidence of my parents' actual financial situation. She didn't sugarcoat her response. "Miriam, they're abusive. This is financial abuse mixed with emotional manipulation. If you give in now, it'll never stop. They'll bleed you dry for the rest of your life because you taught them they could." Her warning resonated in my chest because part of me had been considering just paying to make the nightmare end, to buy peace and stop the daily assault on my phone and email. But Nora saw what I was too close to see clearly. Compliance wouldn't bring peace. It would bring escalation. Once they knew I could be controlled through guilt and pressure, every future demand would be easier for them to make and harder for me to resist. 2 weeks after the initial demand, Bianca scheduled her bridal shower at an expensive country club, one of those places where the parking lot was filled with luxury cars and the membership required sponsorship from existing members. The invitation came to me via email with a note from my mother that made it clear attendance was mandatory, not optional. I debated skipping it, but something told me that absence would be used against me even more effectively than presence, so I drove to the country club that Saturday afternoon with a sense of impending doom. The moment I walked into the private event room, decorated with enough flowers to supply a funeral home, I knew I'd made a mistake. This wasn't a shower, it was a stage, and I was the unwilling star of a performance I hadn't rehearsed for. 60 women filled the room, relatives, family, friends, Bianca's college acquaintances, Preston's female relatives, all dressed in pastels and drinking champagne while they waited for the festivities to begin. My mother didn't waste time with subtlety. 10 minutes after I arrived, she clinked her glass to get everyone's attention and launched into a speech that made my stomach drop. She talked about the beautiful upcoming wedding, about how special it was to see her baby girl marry such a wonderful man, and then she turned directly to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But none of this would be possible without Miriam's incredible generosity. Let's all take a moment to thank her for funding this beautiful wedding and making her sister's dreams come true. The room erupted in applause. 60 pairs of eyes turned to me expectantly, faces smiling with approval and appreciation, hands clapping in gratitude for a sacrifice I hadn't made and a commitment I'd never given. I sat frozen in my chair, my face burning, unable to make a scene in front of all these witnesses without confirming every negative thing my parents had probably prepared people to think about me. Bianca gave an Oscar-worthy performance, her eyes filling with tears as she walked over to embrace me in front of the crowd. She spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, her voice choked with emotion that I knew was completely manufactured. I don't even know what to say. Having a sister like you, someone who would do something this amazing, it just means everything to me. You're not just paying for a wedding, you're showing me what family really means. The women in the room actually sighed at this display, some dabbing their own eyes with napkins, completely sold on the narrative of sisterly sacrifice and generosity. I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body, trapped in a nightmare where I couldn't speak or move, forced to smile while my family publicly committed me to a financial obligation it explicitly refused. After the shower ended and most guests had left, I cornered my parents in the country club parking lot. The afternoon had been humiliating enough that I didn't care who might overhear the confrontation. I demanded they stop spreading lies, stop telling people I'd agreed to pay, and retract their fabricated story before it went any further. My father's response was to explode with an anger that seemed designed to intimidate me into backing down. "How dare you embarrass your sister like this? How dare you make a scene on what should be a happy day?" My mother switched to victim mode, her voice rising into a wail that attracted attention from people walking to their cars. "We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? By making us look like liars? This is about your sister's happiness, and you're ruining it because you're selfish." Bianca joined the performance, rushing over with fresh tears streaming down her face. "You're ruining the happiest time of my life. Why are you doing this to me? What did I ever do to deserve a sister who hates me?" I became aware that several people had stopped to watch our confrontation, some even pulling out their phones. The optics were terrible. To any observer, I appeared to be the aggressor, attacking my emotional mother and crying sister in a parking lot after they'd just thrown me a lovely party. My parents knew exactly what they were doing, creating a public scene that made me look cruel while they looked like victims of my unreasonable anger. I backed away slowly, realizing that anything I said would be recorded, edited, and used against me. My father's final words followed me to my car. "You have until the end of the month to pay the $85,000, or you're dead to us. Think very carefully about what you're choosing." My mother added her own threat through her tears. "Your grandmother would be so ashamed of you right now." I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, anger and humiliation burning in my chest like acid. The consequences of that parking lot confrontation hit me before I even got home. My phone started buzzing with texts from relatives, each one more accusatory than the last. A cousin I barely knew sent a long message about how disappointed she was in me, how family was supposed to take care of family, how I should be ashamed of myself for putting money before my sister's happiness. An aunt from my father's side texted to say she always knew I was cold and selfish, that my success had gone to my head and made me forget my roots. Someone had filmed the confrontation on their phone and edited it to remove all context, making it look like I'd randomly attacked my crying family members. The video was already circulating through family group chats, shared with commentary about my terrible behavior. A distant cousin even posted it on Facebook with a caption about how money changed people for the worse, and that post had been shared 40 times before I even saw it. My parents had orchestrated a comprehensive smear campaign, and I was watching my reputation disintegrate in real time. I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was driving my parents' desperate aggression. Their manipulation had an edge of panic to it, a frantic energy that suggested this was about more than just tradition or wanting a nice wedding for their daughter. The next morning, I made a decision that felt slightly paranoid but ultimately proved essential. I hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Malcolm Burke, who specialized in financial and personal background checks. I gave him everything I knew about Preston, Bianca, and my parents, asking him to dig into their finances, their social circles, and anything else that might explain why $85,000 had become the hill they were willing to destroy our family on. While Malcolm worked his investigation, my parents escalated to a new level of harassment by showing up at my workplace. My office building had a large lobby with a reception desk, and that's where my mother staged her next performance. She arrived during lunch hour when maximum employees and visitors were passing through, and she made sure her breakdown was loud enough to attract attention from multiple floors. She wailed about her ungrateful daughter, crying so dramatically that security didn't know whether to escort her out or call an ambulance. She told anyone who would listen that she was a heartbroken mother whose successful daughter had abandoned her family in their time of need, refusing to help her own sister have a decent wedding despite making more money than she knew what to do with. The spectacle lasted 20 minutes before security finally convinced her to leave, but the damage was done. By the time I returned from an off-site meeting, HR had already called me in to discuss the family issues that were affecting the work environment. Sitting in the HR director's office was one of the most humiliating experiences of my professional life. I had to explain that my mother's public breakdown was part of a coordinated campaign to manipulate me into paying for my sister's wedding, a sentence that sounded absurd even as I said it. The HR director, a kind woman named Patricia who seemed genuinely sympathetic, nevertheless had to address the fact that my personal drama had created a scene in our workplace. She asked if I needed time off to deal with family issues, if there were resources the company could provide, and whether I felt safe, questions that made me realize how serious this situation had become. I assured her I was handling it and that it wouldn't happen again, though I had no idea if that was true. As I left her office, I saw coworkers whispering, their eyes following me with a mixture of curiosity and pity that made me want to disappear. Malcolm called me 3 days later with results that exceeded even my suspicious expectations. We met at a coffee shop far from my neighborhood, and he slid a folder across the table with the casual manner of someone delivering explosive information regularly. The first bombshell was about Preston. The wealthy finance guy with the important family connections was living a complete lie. He was drowning in debt, his credit cards maxed out across multiple accounts, his bank statements showing a man living far beyond his means to maintain an illusion of wealth. Had been lying to Bianca about his financial status since they started dating, creating an elaborate fiction about trust funds and family money that didn't exist. His family wasn't wealthy either. Malcolm had found property records showing they were mortgaged to the hilt, maintaining appearances through debt while teetering on the edge of financial collapse. The wedding wasn't about love or celebration. It was about Preston impressing his boss and colleagues, trying to leverage the appearance of success into an actual promotion at his firm. The second revelation hit even harder. Malcolm had found evidence that my parents had lost $150,000 in a cryptocurrency scam the previous year. They'd invested heavily based on advice from someone at their golf club, putting money into a scheme that promised massive returns and delivered nothing but worthless digital tokens. They'd hidden this financial disaster from everyone, too embarrassed to admit they'd been scammed, and too proud to let their social circle know they'd lost so much money. They couldn't afford to pay for Bianca's wedding without exposing their situation, revealing that they'd blown their savings on a foolish investment and had to rebuild their finances from a diminished position. Making me pay for the wedding solved multiple problems for them. It funded Bianca's event, preserved their reputation, and allowed them to continue pretending they were still financially stable. But the third betrayal was the one that truly hurt because it revealed Bianca's active participation in the manipulation. Malcolm had recovered text messages between my sister and her friends, conversations where Bianca discussed her desperate situation with shocking callousness. She knew Preston was broke. She'd known for months, but she was in too deep to back out, too committed to the fantasy of marrying into wealth to admit the truth. More damning were messages specifically about me. Bianca had written to a friend, "Miriam's loaded and doesn't even spend her money on anything fun. She won't even miss $85,000. Mom and Dad just need to push harder and she'll cave." Another message showed her laughing about my tendency to prioritize family harmony. "She's such a people pleaser. She'll pay eventually just to stop the guilt trips." There was no remorse, no guilt about what they were putting me through. I was simply a resource to be exploited, an ATM machine that needed the right code to make it dispense cash. Sitting in that coffee shop, reading through Malcolm's report with growing horror, everything suddenly made terrible sense. The desperation, the public humiliation, the coordinated attacks, all of it was driven by panic. They needed my money to maintain their lies and save their reputations. My father's aggressive anger, my mother's theatrical tears, Bianca's social media manipulation, none of it was about family or love or tradition. It was about using me to solve problems that created through their own poor decisions and dishonesty. The realization should have made me angrier, but instead I felt a strange calm settling over me. I finally understood that I wasn't dealing with family who loved me and were expressing that love poorly. I was dealing with people who viewed me as a financial resource, nothing more, and they were willing to destroy my reputation and peace of mind to access that resource. Understanding that changed everything. When I continued refusing to pay despite the mounting pressure, my parents moved beyond emotional manipulation into active sabotage of my life. My father made multiple calls to my employer, speaking to anyone who would listen about his concerns regarding my ethical character. He claimed I had stolen money from the family, a complete fabrication designed to plant seeds of doubt about my integrity. Anonymous complaints were filed with my company's ethics hotline, messages alleging financial impropriety and suggesting the company should investigate my background. These complaints triggered an internal review, and I found myself called into a meeting with a vice president and a representative from legal. I had to sit in a conference room and defend myself against accusations I knew came from my own father, explaining the family situation while trying to maintain professional composure. The experience was degrading beyond description, having to prove my innocence to my employer while knowing my parent was actively trying to sabotage my career. My mother took a different approach, targeting my personal life and reputation in the neighborhood where I'd recently bought a condo. She sent letters to my neighbors, carefully worded messages expressing concern about my behavior and suggesting I might be dangerous. She told people I had a history of violence, that I'd threatened family members, that she was worried about what I might do. These letters didn't make specific enough accusations to be clearly defamatory, but they were designed to make people uncomfortable around me, to isolate me socially and create an atmosphere of suspicion. I started noticing neighbors who'd previously been friendly, now avoiding eye contact, residents who used to chat with me in the lobby now hurrying past without acknowledgement. My mother had poisoned my home environment, turned my refuge into another battleground. Bianca's contribution was a long, vitriolic Facebook post that went viral within our extended social network. She wrote thousands of words about toxic siblings who abandon family when they're needed most, describing a thinly veiled version of our situation that painted her as the innocent victim of a cruel, wealthy sister who valued money more than love. She didn't use my name, but she didn't need to. Everyone who read it knew exactly who she meant. The post was shared hundreds of times, commented on by people I'd gone to high school with, friends from college, distant relatives, and complete strangers who felt qualified to judge me based on her one-sided narrative. My phone filled with messages from old acquaintances, asking if the accusations were true, former friends expressing disappointment, and people I barely remembered telling me I should be ashamed. My reputation, built over years of hard work and ethical behavior, was being systematically destroyed by people who were supposed to love me. The financial sabotage came next, and it was the moment I realized my parents had crossed from manipulation into criminality. I received an alert from my bank about suspicious activity on my accounts, someone attempting to access my savings and checking accounts using my personal information. The fraud protection team flagged the attempts before any money was transferred, but the investigation revealed the access attempts had come from my parents' home computer. They'd tried to steal from me directly, frustrated that emotional manipulation wasn't working fast enough. When the bank's security team traced the IP address and confronted me with the evidence, I felt something inside me break. These were people who'd raised me, who'd celebrated my childhood birthdays and helped me with homework. Now they were attempting theft, willing to commit fraud to get money they had no right to. The bank temporarily froze my accounts as a security measure, leaving me without access to my own money while they investigated, another consequence of my parents' criminal behavior. The breaking point came late one Thursday night when my parents, sister, and Preston showed up at my apartment building. They rang the buzzer for my unit repeatedly, and when I didn't answer, they began pounding on the main entrance door, their voices echoing through the lobby as they shouted accusations and demands. This went on for hours. Other residents called the police, reporting a disturbance, and when officers arrived, my family immediately switched into victim mode. They told the police they were just trying to reconcile with their daughter, to work out a family misunderstanding, and they acted wounded that I wouldn't speak to them. The officers, dealing with what appeared to be a family squabble, suggested we work it out like adults and left without taking any action. After the police departed, my father shouted through the door one final time, his voice full of rage and something that sounded like genuine hatred. "Last chance, Miriam. Pay for the wedding or we destroy you completely. This is your final warning." That night, alone in my apartment, listening to my family's threats echo in my memory, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being the victim. I was done trying to placate them, done hoping that reason or boundaries or explanation would make them stop. They'd shown me exactly who they were, and I finally believed them. They were people willing to commit fraud, sabotage my career, poison my reputation, and terrorize me in my own home to get what they wanted. Fighting back wasn't just necessary, it was the only rational response to their escalating abuse. I spent that entire weekend gathering evidence, taking screenshots of every text message, saving every voicemail, compiling the private investigator's report, documenting the bank fraud attempt, and organizing everything into a comprehensive file. If they wanted war, I would give them war, but I would fight smart, using the legal system and the truth as my weapons. Monday morning, I walked into the office of Gilbert Hayes, an attorney who specialized in family law and harassment cases. His reputation was formidable, a former prosecutor who'd transitioned to private practice and built a career protecting people from exactly the kind of abuse I was experiencing. I spread my documentation across his conference table, the physical evidence of months of manipulation, threats, and criminal behavior. Gilbert spent 2 hours reviewing everything, his expression growing darker as he read through text messages, watched the edited parking lot video, examined the bank fraud report, and studied Malcolm's investigation into my family's lies. When he finally looked up at me, his first words were reassuring in their directness. "We can stop this, but you need to be prepared for your family to escalate before they retreat. People like this don't surrender easily." I told him I understood, that I was done negotiating with emotional terrorists, and I wanted to use every legal tool available to protect myself and hold them accountable. The first step was filing for a restraining order against my parents and Bianca. Gilbert prepared the petition meticulously, attaching evidence of their stalking behavior, the harassment at my workplace, the fraud attempt, the threatening messages, and the incident at my apartment building. He documented a pattern of escalating abuse designed to coerce me into giving them money, behavior that met the legal standard for harassment and presented a credible threat to my safety and well-being. The court date was set for 2 weeks out, and in the meantime, the temporary restraining order would prevent them from contacting me directly or coming within 500 feet of my home or workplace. When the sheriff's deputy served them with the papers, my mother called from a friend's phone, screaming about betrayal and threatening to make me regret turning against my own family. I recorded the call, another piece of evidence for the permanent order. My second counterstrike was more public and far more devastating to their carefully constructed narrative. I spent an entire evening crafting a detailed social media post that laid out the complete truth of what had been happening. I wrote it carefully, keeping my tone factual rather than emotional, presenting the situation as a timeline supported by evidence. I explained how my parents had demanded I pay $85,000 for my sister's wedding, how they'd told family and friends Eid volunteered when Eid explicitly refused, how they'd staged public confrontations to manipulate perception, and how they'd escalated to workplace sabotage and fraud when emotional manipulation failed. I included screenshots with names redacted where necessary, showing the threatening messages, the evidence of the bank fraud attempt, and relevant portions of the private investigator's report that revealed Preston's financial lies and my parents' cryptocurrency losses. I explained that I was sharing this publicly because they'd already made it public through their own social media campaign, and I deserved the opportunity to present the truth. The post went viral in ways I never anticipated. Within 24 hours, it had been shared 50,000 times. The comments section filled with thousands of responses, and the overwhelming majority were supportive. People shared their own stories of family members who'd demanded money, parents who'd played favorites, relatives who'd used guilt and manipulation as weapons. The validation was overwhelming and healing in ways I hadn't expected. Strangers told me I was brave for setting boundaries, applauded me for documenting everything, and encouraged me to stand firm against people who clearly saw me as a resource rather than a person. Some comments came from people in my hometown who'd always suspected my parents treated me differently than Bianca but had never said anything. Others came from psychology professionals who identified the pattern as financial abuse and emotional manipulation, giving names to the tactics that had been used against me. The viral post brought unexpected allies out of hiding. People who'd been silenced or marginalized by my family for years. My cousin Dexter, whom I barely knew because he'd been exiled from family events a decade earlier, sent me a long message of support. He revealed that he'd gone through something remarkably similar when he was in his 20s, pressured to give his parents money for my uncle's failed business ventures, and when he refused, he was cut off completely and painted as the villain. He offered to testify about the family's pattern of manipulation if it would help my case, and he connected me with 2 other relatives who had similar stories of being exploited financially and then discarded when they set boundaries. I realized my parents had been doing this for years, targeting different family members when they needed money or support, and I was just the latest victim in a long history of abuse. The public response shifted dramatically in my favor as the post continued spreading beyond my immediate network. Local news outlets picked up the story. fascinated by the drama and the larger questions it raised about family obligations and financial boundaries. A reporter from the city newspaper contacted me for an interview, and after consulting with Gilbert, I agreed to speak on the record. The article that resulted was balanced but ultimately damning to my parents, presenting the documented evidence of their behavior alongside commentary from experts about financial abuse within families. My parents' social media accounts were bombarded with criticism from people who'd read the article and my original post. Bianca's Instagram and Facebook filled with comments calling her entitled and manipulative. Preston's LinkedIn profile received messages from people warning his professional network about his character. Within 72 hours of posting the truth, my family's reputation had collapsed under the weight of their own documented behavior. Watching their carefully maintained image crumble in real time sent my parents into a panic that manifested in increasingly desperate and irrational behavior. They deleted their social media accounts entirely, but it was far too late. Screenshots of their posts had been saved and shared thousands of times. The narrative they'd tried to control had escaped their grasp completely, and now the truth was the dominant story while they looked like liars and abusers. The extended family fractured into factions, with some relatives still reflexively defending my parents out of loyalty or fear, while others publicly supported me and shared their own experiences of being manipulated by the same people. Holiday planning became impossible as people were forced to choose sides, knowing that any gathering would inevitably become a confrontation. My Aunt Caroline, my mother's sister, called to apologize for not seeing the pattern sooner, admitting she'd always noticed the favoritism, but told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. Bianca's wedding plans were collapsing in spectacular fashion. RSVPs that had initially been enthusiastic acceptances were now being quietly withdrawn as guests claimed scheduling conflicts or simply ghosted the couple entirely. People who'd been excited to attend a luxury wedding were now uncomfortable being associated with a family that had become infamous for manipulation and abuse. Preston's boss, a managing director at his financial firm, had seen my viral post along with everyone else in their professional network, and questions were being raised about Preston's judgment and character. The promotion he'd been angling for was suddenly in jeopardy, and the wedding that was supposed to showcase his success was instead highlighting his dishonesty and poor decision-making. The pressure was destroying their relationship, with Bianca blaming Preston for not being wealthy enough to pay for the wedding himself, and Preston blaming Bianca for being too demanding and unrealistic. My mother's attempt at reconciliation was a masterclass in continued manipulation disguised as remorse. She showed up at my workplace again, this time with an enormous bouquet of flowers and a tearful demeanor that fooled the security guard into letting her into the lobby. She approached me as I was entering the building, her voice quavering with emotion as she delivered a performance worthy of an Oscar nomination. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. We were wrong. We got caught up in wedding stress and we pushed too hard. Please, can we just talk and work this out?" I recorded the entire conversation on my phone, which was legal in our state, and it was fortunate that I did because my mother's mask slipped partway through. When I calmly refused to drop the restraining order or retract my social media post, she made a critical mistake. She said, in a moment of frustrated honesty, that Preston's boss was threatening to pass him over for promotion because of all the negative publicity, and if the wedding didn't happen soon and look successful, Preston might lose his job entirely. The apology wasn't about genuine remorse. It was just another manipulation, an attempt to make me fix the consequences of their own behavior. When the fake reconciliation failed, my father made a decision that crossed from harassment into felony territory. He broke into my apartment while I was at work, using some knowledge of the building or perhaps following another resident through the secure entrance. My neighbor across the hall, an elderly woman named Dorothy who kept an eye on the comings and goings in our building, saw him and immediately called the police. Officers arrived within minutes and found my father in my apartment, claiming he was retrieving family photos that belonged to him, a flimsy excuse that fell apart under the slightest scrutiny. The responding officers found him near my laptop, which had been attempting to access, presumably looking for financial information or something he could use against me. He was arrested for breaking and entering, attempted burglary, and when they examined the circumstances more closely, additional charges of attempted computer fraud. The arrest report would become a crucial piece of evidence in the restraining order hearing, demonstrating that the threat my family posed wasn't hypothetical but active and escalating. Bianca's response to the mounting disasters was a complete psychological breakdown, broadcast live on social media for everyone to witness. She posted a series of unhinged rants that revealed the ugliness beneath her carefully curated image. She called me every name imaginable, accused me of destroying her life out of jealousy, claimed I'd always hated her because she was prettier and more popular, and demanded that I fix everything I'd ruined. The posts were manic, barely coherent, full of typos and grammatical errors that suggested she was typing through tears or rage or both. Preston's mother saw these posts and called her son to express serious concerns about Bianca's mental stability and whether this was really the woman he wanted to marry. Preston's family, already uncomfortable with the negative attention and the revelation that they'd have to pay for a wedding they'd assumed someone else was funding, began withdrawing their support entirely. Preston's mother made it clear that if the wedding happened, it would be small, inexpensive, and funded entirely by the couple themselves. The final unraveling came when Preston, under immense pressure from his family and his employer, sat Bianca down and admitted the truth about his finances. He confessed that he wasn't wealthy, that his family wasn't wealthy, that the lifestyle he'd been projecting was funded entirely by debt he could barely service. The fantasy Bianca had been living, the dream of marrying into money and escaping to a life of luxury, evaporated in a single conversation. She called me from a blocked number, her voice raw from screaming, and unleashed a torrent of blame that held me responsible for every bad thing happening in her life. "You ruined everything. Preston's family hates me now. Everyone thinks I'm a terrible person. This wedding was supposed to be perfect and you destroyed it because you're selfish and hateful." I let her rant until she exhausted herself. Then I said quietly that I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd simply refused to be manipulated, and the consequences she was facing were the result of her own choices and lies. She hung up on me, and that was the last direct contact we had. My grandmother, Beatrice, my mother's mother, and the only family member I'd always respected and loved unconditionally, appeared at my apartment door one evening with grocery bags and a determined expression. She was 83 years old but sharp as ever, and she'd been watching the family implosion with a mixture of sadness and anger. She came in, unpacked food for dinner, and told me stories I'd never heard before. She revealed that she'd known about the favoritism toward Bianca since my sister was born, that she'd confronted my parents multiple times over the years about the disparity in how they treated us, and that she'd been gradually frozen out of family events because she refused to participate in the fiction that everything was fair and loving. She brought a box of old letters and cards I'd sent her over the years, evidence of a relationship my parents had tried to minimize, and she offered to testify at the restraining order, hearing about the family's long pattern of emotional manipulation. Having her support felt like being handed a shield after fighting alone for so long, validation from someone whose opinion actually mattered to me. The restraining order hearing became a public spectacle that drew more attention than a typical family court proceeding. The local news sent a reporter because of the viral social media post and the arrest record that was now part of the public record. Judge Patricia Chen presided over the hearing with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd seen every family manipulation tactic and wasn't impressed by any of them. Gilbert presented our evidence methodically, building a timeline of escalating harassment supported by text messages, recordings, the bank fraud attempt, police reports from the apartment incident, and my father's arrest record. Dexter testified about his own experience being manipulated by my parents, establishing a pattern of behavior. Nora testified about witnessing months of emotional abuse. Grandmother Beatrice testified about decades of favoritism and the family's history of punishing anyone who set boundaries. The evidence was overwhelming and presented with devastating precision. My parents' attorney, clearly working with a weak case, tried to characterize everything as a misunderstanding between loving family members who'd let emotions get out of control. Judge Chen wasn't buying it. She reviewed the evidence, listened to testimony, and granted a restraining order requiring my parents and Bianca to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace for a minimum of 6 months. With the possibility of extension, the judge's comments from the bench were pointed, noting that the documented behavior showed a pattern of financial coercion, emotional manipulation, and criminal conduct that posed a genuine threat. As I left the courthouse, my parents stood on the steps looking diminished and angry, their power over me finally broken by the legal system. The wedding that Bianca had dreamed about for years, the Pinterest-perfect celebration that was supposed to launch her into a life of luxury and social status, collapsed completely in the weeks following the restraining order hearing. With no $85,000 from me, no financial support from Preston's family, and their own savings depleted by legal fees and the need to maintain their lifestyle despite hidden losses, my parents couldn't fund the extravagant event they'd promised. The luxury venue released the contract when the deposit check bounced, an embarrassment that spread through the vendor community and made other businesses reluctant to work with them. The celebrity florist, the famous photographer, the designer dress boutique, and the high-end caterer all withdrew their services, citing payment concerns or schedule conflicts, though everyone understood the real reason was the toxic publicity. Preston's promotion was officially denied after HR reviewed the entire situation and decided his judgment was questionable. The final blow came when Preston himself walked away from the engagement, unable to handle the pressure, the shame, or the reality that Bianca was not the person Head thought he was marrying. My parents faced consequences that extended far beyond a cancelled wedding. My father's arrest record became public information, accessible to anyone who searched his name online, and his employer, a financial services firm, decided that an employee charged with fraud and burglary posed an unacceptable reputational risk. He was terminated from the position Head held for 23 years, losing not just his salary but also the pension benefits that would have vested in 2 more years. My mother's social circle, the country club friends and church group women Shed spent decades cultivating, quietly distanced themselves from her once the truth emerged about the manipulation and lies. Invitations dried up, calls went unreturned, and she found herself isolated in a community where reputation was everything and hers was now irreparably damaged. They were forced to sell their house, the same house I'd grown up in, to pay mounting legal fees and replace the income my father had lost. They moved to a smaller town 2 hours away, someplace where no one knew their story, and they could attempt to rebuild their lives far from the whispers and judgment. My parents sent one final letter before they moved, delivered through a lawyer to comply with the restraining order. It contained no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no acceptance of responsibility. Instead, it was 5 pages of venomous blame, holding me accountable for my father's lost job, my mother's social exile, Bianca's broken engagement, and every negative consequence they were facing. They wrote that I had destroyed the family through selfishness and pride, that I'd chosen money over love, and that they hoped I was satisfied with the pain I'd caused. The letter concluded with a declaration that I was no longer their daughter, that they were formally disowning me, and that I should never attempt to contact them again. I read it once, felt nothing but relief, and handed it to Gilbert to file with the other evidence supporting an extension of the restraining order. Their final act of cruelty had liberated me completely, removing any lingering guilt or obligation I might have felt. The extended family finished fracturing along predictable lines, with the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays becoming exercises in diplomatic impossibility. People who wanted to maintain relationships with multiple family members found themselves forced to choose, knowing that any gathering, including both me and my parents, would end in conflict or legal violations. Grandmother Beatrice solved the problem by announcing she would host alternative holiday celebrations, and anyone who wanted to attend was welcome as long as they could behave civilly and refrain from discussing the family drama. Her gatherings drew 12 relatives the first year, people who'd either supported me throughout or who'd come to understand the truth once the evidence became public. These smaller holidays were more peaceful than any I'd experienced in years, filled with genuine conversation and affection rather than tension and performance. I found myself grateful for the fracture, for the way crisis had separated people who actually cared from people who'd simply been going through motions. Grandmother Beatrice made one more decision that sent shockwaves through what remained of the family structure. She met with her estate attorney and completely rewrote her will, removing my parents and Bianca as beneficiaries and distributing her estate among grandchildren and relatives who'd been marginalized or mistreated over the years. She told me about this change directly, not to make me feel obligated, but to explain that she was correcting an injustice and ensuring that her assets went to people who'd actually valued family relationships rather than those who'd exploited them. When my parents discovered this through their own attorney, my mother made one last desperate attempt to contact Beatrice through a family friend, trying to manipulate her into changing the will back, claiming she was being poisoned against them by my lies. Beatrice shut down the attempt immediately, telling the friend to relay a message that Shed witnessed their behavior firsthand for decades and had made her decision with a clear mind and conscience. Bianca tried her own approach, calling Beatrice and crying about how unfair everything had become, but my grandmother saw through the performance and told her that she was welcome to rebuild a relationship through genuine effort and changed behavior, but money would never again be part of the equation. My professional life not only recovered from the sabotage attempts but actually improved in ways I hadn't anticipated. My employer, having witnessed how I handled an extreme family crisis with documentation, legal action, and professional composure, even while under attack, recognized qualities that translated well to leadership. 6 months after the restraining order hearing, I was promoted to Senior Vice President, a position that came with significant salary increase to $180,000 annually, expanded responsibilities, and a level of respect that made all the struggle worthwhile. The company also asked me to speak on a panel about maintaining professional boundaries and handling personal crises, recognition that my experience, while painful, had demonstrated important character traits. I used my platform to advocate for others facing family financial abuse, speaking openly about the manipulation tactics, the importance of documentation, and the reality that sometimes the healthiest choice is complete disconnection from toxic family members. My personal life transformed as I healed from years of emotional abuse and began building relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. I'd met Fletcher during a support group for people dealing with family estrangement, a gathering recommended by my therapist as part of processing the trauma. He was an attorney specializing in elder law, kind and thoughtful in ways that felt foreign after years of my family's manipulation. Our relationship developed slowly, built on honest communication and healthy boundaries, both of us aware of red flags and committed to avoiding the patterns we'd escaped. For the first time in my life, I was dating someone who respected my decisions, celebrated my successes without jealousy, and never made me feel guilty for prioritizing my own well-being. 6 months into our relationship, he met grandmother Beatrice and Nora, the two people whose opinions mattered most to me, and they both approved wholeheartedly. Fletcher understood my family history without trying to fix it or convince me to reconcile, accepting that some relationships are too damaged to repair and that walking away was strength, not weakness. 2 years after that dinner table confrontation where my father slammed an $85,000 invoice in front of me and demanded I fund my sister's fantasy wedding, my life looked nothing like the nightmare it'd been living, and everything like the future it'd been afraid to hope for. I was thriving in every measurable way, living in a beautiful condo I'd purchased in a neighborhood where neighbors actually knew and liked me, excelling in a career that challenged and fulfilled me, and building a family of choice with people who demonstrated through actions, not just words, that they valued me as a person rather than a resource. My relationship with Fletcher had deepened into discussions about marriage and future plans, conversations that felt joyful rather than transactional, exciting rather than obligatory. The small circle I'd built with grandmother Beatrice, cousin Dexter, Nora, and a handful of other genuine relationships provided more emotional support and authentic love than my biological family ever had. My parents violated the restraining order extension one final time, demonstrating that even legal consequences couldn't completely override their compulsion to manipulate and control. My mother sent a letter through a distant cousin, violating both the spirit and letter of the court order. The letter claimed they were dying, both of them facing serious health issues, a claim I immediately suspected was fabricated given their history of dishonesty. They wanted reconciliation before it was too late, she wrote, begging me to see them one final time so we could have closure and peace. Bianca added her own note to the letter, just 2 words scrawled at the bottom of the page. I'm sorry. Not sorry for specific actions, not accountability for the manipulation and abuse, not acknowledgement of the pain caused, just 2 words that cost her nothing and changed nothing. My father added nothing at all, apparently still too proud to admit wrongdoing or too angry to fake contrition, his silence more honest than any words he might have written. I spent an evening writing a response letter that I never intended to send, a therapeutic exercise my counselor had recommended for processing remaining anger and hurt. I wrote everything I'd never been able to say, all the observations about their favoritism and manipulation, all the ways their treatment had damaged me, all the lies they'd told and the trust they'd destroyed. I outlined every incident of abuse with the same detailed precision I'd used in legal documents, creating a comprehensive record of their failures as parents and as human beings. The letter ended with a paragraph about forgiveness that felt true and hard-won. I forgive you for my own peace, not because you deserve it or earned it. I forgive you, so I can stop carrying the weight of your failures and move forward without bitterness poisoning my future. But forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. Some relationships are too broken to fix, and ours is one of them. You will never have access to my life, my resources, or my emotional energy again. I burned the letter in my fireplace with Fletcher sitting beside me, watching the pages curl and blacken, feeling the catharsis of letting go without needing them to understand or approve. The actual response I sent was far simpler and came through Gilbert's office to maintain the legal boundaries. The cousin who'd delivered their letter received a brief message from my attorney, reminding my parents that contact of any kind violated the restraining order and that any further attempts would result in additional legal action. I returned their letter unopened with a note stating that I had no interest in reconciliation under any circumstances and that they should respect the boundaries I'd established. There was no detailed explanation, no emotional processing, no attempt to make them understand my position. They'd demonstrated repeatedly that they weren't capable of understanding or respecting boundaries, so the only effective response was firm, unemotional enforcement of the legal barriers protecting me. The cousin had been used as their messenger, apologized for being manipulated into helping them violate the order, and promised it wouldn't happen again. The wisdom I gained through this painful experience became a framework I used to help others navigate similar situations, both professionally through speaking engagements and personally through conversations with friends and colleagues facing their own family challenges. I learned that you cannot negotiate with emotional terrorists, people who use guilt, obligation, and fear as weapons to control your behavior. Any concession is interpreted as weakness, any boundary as negotiable, any explanation as an opening for further manipulation. I learned that family by blood guarantees nothing about love, loyalty, or genuine care, and that clinging to biological relationships out of obligation while they destroy your well-being is not noble, it's self-destructive. I learned that setting boundaries is not selfish, it's self-preservation, and people who accuse you of selfishness for protecting yourself are usually angry that they can no longer exploit you. I learned that guilt is their weapon while clarity is your shield, and the moment you see manipulation tactics for what they are, they lose much of their power. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the only winning move is walking away completely, refusing to play a game rigged against you from the start, and building a new life with people who actually deserve a place in it. My promotion to senior vice president at 32 made me one of the youngest executives in the company's history, and I used that platform to mentor young women facing family pressure around money, boundaries, and the expectation that they should sacrifice their own needs to subsidize relatives' choices. I spoke at conferences about financial boundaries and family dynamics, sharing my story to help others recognize manipulation patterns before they escalated to the level I'd experienced. I started a blog that attracted thousands of followers, people dealing with toxic family members who needed validation that they weren't crazy or selfish for setting limits. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of messages from people who'd been manipulated, exploited, or abused by family members and felt too guilty to protect themselves. My story gave them permission to prioritize their own well-being, to understand that biological connection doesn't justify exploitation, and to see that walking away from toxicity isn't failure, it's wisdom. The peace it found was deeper and more stable than any temporary harmony it achieved through compliance in the past. I no longer waited for my parents' approval or mourned the relationship we'd never actually had. I stopped carrying guilt for their consequences or responsibility for their happiness. Grandmother Beatrice's love showed me what real family relationships looked like, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and manipulation. When Fletcher proposed during a weekend trip to the mountains, presenting a ring head designed specifically for me without any drama or audience, I said yes with the kind of uncomplicated joy I'd never experienced before. We planned a small, intimate wedding ceremony with 20 guests, people who'd earned their place in our lives through years of support and authentic friendship. The entire event cost $8,000, exactly what we wanted to spend, designed around our preferences rather than anyone else's expectations or judgments. Our honeymoon in Italy felt like the victory lap of someone who'd fought a war and survived to enjoy the peace. We wandered through ancient cities and tiny villages, ate incredible food and drank excellent wine, talked for hours about our future plans and the family we wanted to build together based on the lessons we'd both learned from our pasts. I thought occasionally about my parents and Bianca, wondering if they were happy in their new town, if they'd learned anything from the consequences they'd faced, if they ever took responsibility for the damage they'd caused. But these thoughts no longer carried weight or pain. They were simply people I used to know, whose choices had led them down a path away from me, and I felt nothing but relief that they were no longer part of my life. On the flight home from Italy, watching clouds pass beneath the airplane window while Fletcher slept beside me, I found myself reflecting on the entire journey from that dinner table confrontation to this moment of hard-won peace. My parents had demanded I pay for my sister's wedding, insisting it was my duty, threatening to cast me out forever if I refused. They'd tried to break me through manipulation, public humiliation, sabotage, and even criminal behavior. But every attack had made me stronger. Every betrayal had clarified what I deserved, and every boundary I'd enforced had built the foundation for a life that was genuinely mine. I'd chosen to disappear from their toxicity, and in doing so, I'd found myself. The family I'd built through choice was worth infinitely more than the one I'd left behind through necessity, and I'd never been happier in my entire life. The final truth I'd learned, the one I shared at every speaking engagement and wrote in every blog post, was simple but profound. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or elaborate payback. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, building a life so fulfilling and peaceful that your former abusers become irrelevant footnotes in your story rather than the main characters. I'd taken the ashes of family destruction and used them as fertilizer to grow something beautiful, something that was entirely mine, something no one could take from me or manipulate me into surrendering. My parents had yelled their ultimatum, expecting compliance and submission. Instead, I'd given them the one response they'd never anticipated. I'd chosen myself, and that choice had set me free. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have paid for the wedding to keep the peace, or would you have stood firm on your boundaries like I did? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, or if you've dealt with similar family manipulation, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect yourself from toxic family members. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories about setting boundaries, surviving family drama, and building the life you deserve. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you find the courage to stand up for yourself when the people who should love you try to tear you down instead. Remember, you don't owe anyone access to your peace, not even family, especially not family who treats you like an ATM instead of a person. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.